He was 32 years old. He weighed 130 pounds. He was the most physically developed human being that most of the people around him had ever been close to. And he was dying. Slowly, systematically, in ways that the people nearest to him could see and could not stop. The man who trained beside him in the final months said later that watching Bruce Lee work was the most frightening thing he had ever witnessed on a film set. Not because of the speed or the power. Because of what was underneath it, the specific quality of a body that was being asked to perform at a level that the body's biology could not sustain indefinitely, and that was performing anyway, because the person inside the body had decided that the body's limits were not the final authority. On July 20, 1973, Bruce Lee lay down on a bed in a colleague's apartment in Hong Kong with a headache. He never woke up. The official cause of death was cerebral edema, brain swelling. He was 32 years old. Enter the Dragon premiered 6 days later and made him the most famous martial artist who had ever lived. Stay with this story. Because 50 years after his death, the man who was with him on set every day has finally said things he did not say before. And what he says about the final weeks, about what he saw, about what he knew, about what he could not stop, changes the story in ways that the official account never fully addressed. Those of you who have watched someone extraordinary burn themselves out, who have been close to a person of exceptional capability who could not find the gear between maximum and nothing, who treated their body as a vehicle for ambition rather than a partner in it, who could not accept the basic human requirement for rest because rest felt like losing ground they would never recover, this story is for you. You know the specific helplessness of watching someone who is right about almost everything be catastrophically wrong about the one thing that matters most. You know what it looks like when discipline becomes something else, when the quality that produced the extraordinary achievement is the same quality that destroys the person who achieved it. Bruce Lee was the most disciplined human being that most of the people who knew him had ever encountered. He was also, in the final year of his life, the most reckless. And the man who watched it happen every day finally told the truth about what he saw. Bolo Yeung was not a peripheral figure in the story of Bruce Lee's final months. He was not a fan, not a bit player, not someone who had been in the same building a few times and had stories to tell. He was a competitive bodybuilder from Hong Kong whose physical presence was so specific, so genuinely, documentably unusual, that Bruce Lee personally wanted him for Enter the Dragon because Bruce understood that no amount of technique could produce the visual language that Bolo's body produced, and Enter the Dragon needed both. Born Yangzi in 1946, Bolo had been competing in bodybuilding since his teens and had achieved the specific development that separated serious competitive bodybuilding from recreational fitness, not the cosmetic smoothness of someone who had trained for appearance, but the dense, striated, functional mass of someone whose muscles had been built under competitive pressure across decades. His chest, his arms, his neck, all of them were outsized in the specific way that genuine development was outsized, in ways that made structural sense rather than aesthetic sense. He had also been training in Chinese martial arts since childhood. Not as a complement to the bodybuilding, as a separate discipline, pursued with the seriousness that the Hong Kong martial arts community in the 1950s and 1960s demanded of serious practitioners. He understood fighting. He could read a practitioner's quality from the way they moved before they struck. He had been in rooms with serious people doing serious things and had the calibrated assessment of someone who knew the difference between performance and capability. When he arrived on the set of Enter the Dragon and encountered Bruce Lee, his assessment was immediate. This was not a man performing capability for a camera. This was something he had not seen before. The set of Enter the Dragon was a specific place and time in the history of cinema that is difficult to fully reconstruct from the outside. It was 1973. It was Hong Kong. It was the film that would either prove or disprove the claim that martial arts films could find a global audience, that a Chinese actor could carry a major Hollywood co-production, could be the protagonist rather than the threat or the punchline, could open the door that the American entertainment industry had kept closed against Asian leading men for decades. Bruce Lee understood the stakes with a completeness that the production team around him, mostly American, mostly unfamiliar with the cultural weight that a Chinese actor placing himself at the center of a Hollywood action film carried, did not have access to. For them, it was a film. A good film, a film they believed in, but a film. For Bruce Lee, it was something close to a war. He had been told for years by the American entertainment industry that American audiences would not accept an Asian leading man. He had been passed over for roles he was more qualified for than the actors who received them. He had been offered secondary positions in projects that were built on his ideas. He had taken his talent to Hong Kong when America declined to accommodate it, and had built there the career that America had refused to give him, and had now returned to prove the point that American executives had spent years telling him was unprovable. He was not going to prove it badly. This meant that nothing was acceptable at the level it would have been acceptable from anyone else. His own performances, the choreography, the lighting, the way the camera captured his movement, all of it was held to a standard that he monitored personally and that he would redo until it met the standard, regardless of the director's satisfaction with what had already been shot, regardless of the time already spent, regardless of what the schedule allowed. On the day that Bolo Yeung first watched him work, Bruce had been on the same shot for 3 hours. 3 hours on a single sequence that the director had declared acceptable after the second take. Bruce had not declared it acceptable. He was on his 11th take when Bolo arrived on set. Bolo watched him work that first day with the assessment he brought to everything physical. He watched the speed, which was what everyone watched, because the speed was the thing that was impossible to not watch, the way Bruce's techniques arrived before the eye had finished registering the precursor movement, the specific quality of motion that the camera had needed to be adjusted to accommodate because standard filming speeds produced a blur where a technique should have been. He watched the power, which was the second thing, the thing that explained why the stuntmen on set had all been briefed about controlled contact and why Bruce had been paired specifically with the stuntmen who had the most experience receiving technique from serious practitioners. And then he watched the cost. This was the thing that Bolo saw from the first day that he had not anticipated. Bruce Lee's capabilities at that moment in 1973 were beyond anything Bolo had encountered. The speed, the power, the precision, the tactical intelligence that organized all of it, these were things that decades of competitive training had given Bolo the reference points to evaluate, and his evaluation was that what he was watching was operating in a category he had not previously experienced. And it was costing something that the performance did not show. Between takes, Bruce's recovery time was longer than the performance suggested it should be. Not significantly longer. A practitioner who did not have Bolo's specific combination of bodybuilding knowledge and martial arts experience would not have identified it as a recovery issue. The gaps between takes looked like the gaps between takes always looked: a man in motion, thinking, consulting with the director, staying loose. But Bolo was watching the sweating. In the Hong Kong humidity, under the lights, doing the level of physical work that Enter the Dragon required, sweating was expected. Everyone on set was sweating. But Bruce's sweating had a quality that Bolo could not reconcile with the performance level. It was excessive in a way that was not proportionate to the exertion, as if the thermal regulation system was working harder than the exertion demanded, as if the body was fighting something that the activity alone did not explain. And between this sweating, Bruce was not drinking. This was the detail that Bolo would return to in every subsequent account. Not that Bruce was not drinking enough, that he was not drinking at all. In the intervals between takes, when other cast and crew members reached for water bottles and sports drinks and the tea that was perpetually available on Chinese film sets, Bruce walked, talked, consulted his notes, made adjustments, and did not drink. When crew members offered him water, he declined. Sometimes with a dismissal of the hand that communicated it had already been considered and rejected. Sometimes with a word or two, fine, or later, that communicated the same. Bolo did not say anything the first day. He had not yet established the kind of relationship in which observation translated into concern out loud. By the end of the first week, he had established it. And what he said translated from Cantonese to a form that the translator on set rendered as, "You need to drink. You are losing too much without replacing it." Bruce looked at him. His expression was not annoyed. It was the expression of a man who had received a piece of information he had already considered and made a decision about, and who did not require the information to be redelivered. He said, "I know what I need." The question of why Bruce Lee was not drinking has several answers, none of them complete and all of them true simultaneously. The first was the obsession with physical appearance. Bruce Lee had been performing on camera since childhood. He had come to understand, in the specific technical way of someone who had studied film closely and who had trained with the people who understood cameras, exactly how different the human body's appearance on film was from its appearance in person. The camera did not love all bodies equally. It flattened, it compressed, it changed the relationship between bulk and definition in ways that required compensation. A body that looked lean and defined in person might look soft and blurry on film, and a body that looked almost uncomfortably thin in person might look precisely sculpted under lights. Bruce Lee's body, at the level he maintained it during Enter the Dragon, was the result of a calibration process that accounted for all of these camera effects and produced the specific visual result that he wanted. Not the result that was healthy. Not the result that was sustainable. The result that he wanted. This calibration required him to maintain a body fat percentage that his own physicians had told him was below the advisable range for a man of his age and level of physical activity. It required him to cut water weight to achieve specific definition in specific muscle groups that the camera would emphasize. It required him, in the weeks around filming, to manage his body's water content the way a competitive bodybuilder managed it before a competition, deliberately reducing it to enhance the visual definition that separated adequate from the specific excellence he was pursuing. The problem was that competitive bodybuilders managed water weight around competition, a single day, a single event, and then restored it. Bruce Lee was managing it around a film that was shooting every day, and the restoration was never happening. The second answer was the sweat gland surgery. This was the fact that, when it finally became publicly known, produced in the medical community that encountered it a specific category of reaction, not surprise at the vanity of the decision, but alarm at the functional implications. Bruce Lee had undergone a surgical procedure to remove the eccrine sweat glands from his underarms. The stated motivation was cosmetic. He found visible sweat patches on film to be imperfect, and he eliminated the possibility of their occurrence through the most direct available means. The medical implication was that one of the body's primary mechanisms for thermal regulation had been surgically impaired. The human body manages its core temperature primarily through sweating, the evaporation of fluid from the skin's surface removing heat from the body's interior. When physical exertion generates heat faster than the environment absorbs it, sweating is the primary compensatory mechanism. Impair the sweating mechanism significantly, and the body's ability to maintain safe core temperature under exertion is compromised. The underarms are not the primary sweating location for thermal regulation. The back and torso carry more of that load, but the removal of any significant eccrine gland population reduces overall evaporative capacity. In a man who was training for hours daily in tropical heat, who was performing on a film set under lighting that generated significant additional heat, and who was simultaneously limiting his fluid intake to manage his body's water content for appearance purposes, this reduction in evaporative capacity was not a minor complication. It was a compounding factor in a system that was already being stressed past its design parameters. The third answer was the pain medication. This one had been the most carefully managed fact around Bruce Lee's death, the one that his family and associates had been most reluctant to discuss publicly because it felt like the most humanizing and therefore the most reductive element of the story. Bruce Lee was not just an icon. He was a man who had hurt his back badly in 1970 while performing a straight-legged deadlift without adequate warm-up, and who had received a diagnosis that included possible permanent damage to the sacral nerve and the specific unwelcome information that the back might never fully recover. He did not accept this diagnosis. He trained through it, stretched through it, developed the rehabilitation program that eventually allowed him full functional use of the back again. But the nerve damage produced chronic pain, and chronic pain in a man who viewed his body as a precision instrument produced the specific solution that such men typically produced: medication. In the early 1970s in Hong Kong, the regulation of prescription medications was less systematic than it would later become, and the specific medications prescribed for chronic pain included compounds whose interactions with dehydration and with the physical stress of maximum athletic performance had not been extensively studied. What was known was that certain pain medications affected kidney function. What was also known was that kidney function was relevant to the body's ability to manage water and electrolyte balance. What was less clearly known was how these interactions compounded in a body that was simultaneously dehydrated, overheated, physically stressed to its maximum, and being pushed through those conditions daily without adequate recovery. Bolo Yeung knew about the back pain. He knew about the medication in the general way that someone knows about things they observe on a film set without being told directly, the specific pills that appeared at certain times of day, the moments when Bruce moved with the specific careful quality of someone managing something beneath the movement. He put these things together with the sweating and the not drinking and the training schedule and the weight cutting and produced in himself the assessment that he did not share publicly for 50 years. Something was wrong. Not in the way that something was wrong when a man was sick. In the way that something was wrong when a healthy, extraordinary, highly capable person was systematically dismantling the conditions that had made them what they were, and was doing it for reasons that made complete internal sense and that were leading somewhere that nothing good could follow. The training schedule on Enter the Dragon was one that the production company had negotiated with Bruce Lee as a matter of contractual obligation and had largely ceded control of to Bruce himself, because the experience of attempting to tell Bruce Lee what his training would look like had produced in everyone who attempted it the specific result of being politely corrected and then watching Bruce do what he had planned to do regardless. He trained before the day's filming. He trained during the lunch break. He trained after the day's filming ended. He trained on weekends when no filming was scheduled. The specific content of the training varied, but the volume did not vary downward. He was not training for a competition with a defined date, the normal limiting factor that produced in competitive athletes the specific periodization of heavy training followed by calculated tapering. He was training as a practice, a discipline, a way of being that did not have an end point, and the practice did not taper because tapering was not a concept he had organized his life around. Beyond the Lookout had trained at levels that the general fitness population would have found incomprehensible, competitive bodybuilding in the era before the physiological sophistication that modern sports science brought to the field required workloads that would have been described as extreme by any reasonable standard. He understood what serious training cost. He had a reference point. Bruce Lee's training schedule, as observed during the making of Enter the Dragon, exceeded Bolo's reference point. Not in the specific weights or the cardio distances or the sparring time, though these were all at the high end of what a person of Bruce's size could reasonably sustain. In the totality of it, the fact that it did not stop. That the hours between training sessions were not rest hours but hours spent reviewing footage, annotating notebooks, working on choreography, conducting philosophical discussions about martial arts that produced in Bruce the same metabolic activation that formal training produced, because Bruce Lee's mind and body were not separate systems and engaging one engaged both. He could not turn it off. Or rather, he had never learned to turn it off, because turning it off had never been required to produce the results he was producing, and the results he was producing had been the only measure he was using. This was the mechanism that Bolo was watching and that he could not find a way to interrupt. The missing footage. This is the element of the Enter the Dragon story that has circulated in film historian and martial arts communities for decades without resolution, and that Bolo Yeung's recent accounts have returned to without fully clarifying. The footage is of a fight. A genuine fight, not a choreographed sequence designed for the camera but an actual exchange between two practitioners at a level that the camera would have captured as something different from what it was accustomed to capturing. The two practitioners were Bruce Lee and Bolo Yeung. According to multiple accounts from crew members who were present during the filming, not from Bolo himself, who maintained silence on this specific subject for many years, but from the people who operated cameras and moved lights and watched takes and whose professional function required them to be present and attentive, this footage was shot. A sequence in which Bruce Lee and Bolo Yeung engaged at a level that was not the controlled, choreography following contact of standard film fighting but something closer to what two serious practitioners produced when the cameras were running and the formal choreography had, in some important sense, been set aside. Why was it set aside? The accounts vary in the specific detail of this. Some describe it as Bruce becoming frustrated with the limitations of choreographed movement, the specific frustration of a man whose body operated at a level that the choreography could not contain, who kept encountering the gaps between the choreography's requirements and his body's instincts and finding the choreography insufficient. Some describe it as a mutual decision between Bruce and Bolo, two serious practitioners who had been circling the edge of genuine engagement for weeks and who found in a specific afternoons filming the specific permission to cross it. Some describe it as something that happened because both men were who they were and the cameras were running and the conditions were sufficient and the outcome was inevitable. What all accounts agree on is that the footage was shot, and that it was not in the final cut of Enter the Dragon, and that no official explanation was ever provided for its absence. Director Robert Clouse never confirmed the footage's existence. Golden Harvest executives declined to address inquiries about it. The editorial team who worked on the film's post-production have been, across 50 years, collectively silent on the subject. Bolo Yeung, asked about it directly in multiple interviews across the decades, produced responses that were neither confirmation nor denial. He would smile at the question and say something about Bruce knowing what worked on camera. He would gesture toward the completed film and say that what was in it was what Bruce wanted. He would pivot to a description of Bruce's capability that was so specific and so detailed that it felt like an answer to the question without addressing the question directly. The most recent accounts have been slightly different. In interviews conducted in the period following his 80th birthday, Bolo Yeung has spoken about Enter the Dragon with a quality that his previous public statements had not contained. Not specifically about the footage, that specific silence appears to have remained intact. But about Bruce Lee in a broader sense, about what he witnessed, about what he knew, about the gap between the public understanding of Bruce Lee's death and what the people who were present understood it to be. These accounts are the reason this story is being told now. The collapse on May 10, 1973 happened during a dubbing session at Golden Harvest Studios. Bruce was standing in the recording studio, looking at playback footage of a scene he was redubbing. He had been there for several hours. The session was routine. Dubbing work was less physically demanding than filming, and Bruce had been using dubbing days as relative rest days, days when the physical output was lower and the cognitive work was higher. He went down. Not gradually, suddenly. The specific quality of a collapse that was neurological rather than muscular, the body systems issuing a shutdown instruction that the consciousness had not been consulted about. He was standing and then he was on the floor, and between those two states there was nothing that the people in the room could describe as transition. They got him to the hospital quickly. The diagnosis was cerebral edema, brain swelling. The same diagnosis that would appear in the autopsy report 68 days later. The treating physician, Dr. Peter Wu, stabilized him. He gave Bruce medication that addressed the swelling. He gave Bruce specific instructions about rest, about hydration, about the physical workload that was and was not advisable given what had just happened. Bruce Lee returned to work within days. This fact, that he returned to work within days of a cerebral edema event that his physician had told him was a serious warning about his body's condition, is the fact that every subsequent understanding of his death must account for. Not because it was unusual for Bruce Lee to receive medical advice and not follow it. Because it was entirely consistent, which made it not aberrant but characteristic. He did not dismiss the warning because he was careless. He did not ignore the physician because he was arrogant. He received the warning, processed it through his understanding of his own body and his own capabilities and his own sense of what was required of him at this specific moment in his life, and concluded that the warning applied to ordinary people in ordinary circumstances and that his circumstances were not ordinary. This was the logic that had made him extraordinary. This was also the logic that was killing him. Bolo Yeung knew about the May collapse. He learned about it through the specific informal channels of a film production, not an official announcement, not a formal communication, but the information that moves through crews and cast during production in the way that all significant information about the people they are working with moves, through concerned conversation between people who have observed things and are comparing observations. When Bolo saw Bruce on set after the return, he watched him with the specific attention of someone checking something against a benchmark. He looked at the sweating. He looked at the not drinking. He looked at the training schedule. None of it had changed. He said nothing that day. He had said things before and had received the response that communicated those things had been considered and were not being accepted. He watched. The notebooks. Bruce Lee's practice of documentation was one of the most extensively confirmed facts about his life. He kept records of everything: training volumes, dietary intake, body weight measurements, injury observations, philosophical notes, observations about martial arts theory, annotations from books he was reading, diagrams of techniques he was developing, records of conversations that had produced useful insights. The notebooks from his final period, the months leading up to the May collapse and the weeks between the collapse and his death, are the subject of a specific historical controversy that has not been resolved and that the available evidence suggests will not be resolved in any complete sense. Multiple people who had access to Bruce Lee's papers in the period immediately following his death have described the final entries as qualitatively different from the preceding entries. Not different in subject matter, Bruce was still recording training observations and philosophical notes, but different in quality. The handwriting was different. Not dramatically, not the shaking or distortion of someone in obvious physical distress, but different in ways that the people who had spent years reading his writing could detect. Less precise. More repetitive. The quality of a hand recording what a mind was producing at a speed or a coherence level that was not what the mind usually produced. The specific phrase "rest is a weapon" appeared multiple times in the final pages. Not once as an aphorism, multiple times, the repetition of a line that was not being recorded for the first time but being returned to, as if the person writing it was trying to make a case to themselves, to argue themselves into something, to use the written word as a persuasive tool directed at the writer. Danny Inosanto, Bruce's closest student and training partner, described the later notebooks in a way that was careful and that conveyed without stating directly the same quality that Bolo Yeung has described from his observational vantage point. He did not say the notebooks showed deterioration. He said they showed a different conversation. He said Bruce seemed to be talking to himself in the later entries in a way that was different from the externally directed observations of the earlier ones. Some pages were missing. Linda Lee confirmed this. She did not speculate publicly about where they had gone. She stated the fact and stopped there. The fact of missing pages from the final notebook has generated extensive speculation about what they contained and who removed them and why. The speculation ranges from the mundane to the conspiratorial. The mundane explanation, that pages were removed by Bruce himself before his death, that the repetitive or distressed quality of what he had written in a bad period made him unwilling to leave those words for later eyes, is consistent with what is known about his character. The conspiratorial explanations, that pages were removed by studio representatives or investigators or business associates who feared what the pages revealed about the circumstances leading to his death, are consistent with the documented fact that multiple parties had access to his apartment before it was officially secured. Neither explanation is provable. The pages are gone. The day Bruce Lee died was a Tuesday. He had spent the afternoon working with Raymond Chow on script discussions for Game of Death, the film he was developing after Enter the Dragon. The meeting was at his home. Chow left in the early evening. Bruce went to the apartment of Betty Ting Pei, an actress who was associated with his production projects. He complained of a headache. He took a tablet of Exhaustion, a combination analgesic and muscle relaxant that had been prescribed to him previously and that contained compounds that subsequent analysis would identify as potentially relevant to his death. He lay down on the bed. He did not wake up. When it became apparent that something was wrong, Betty Ting Pei called Raymond Chow. Chow arrived at the apartment. He could not wake Bruce. An ambulance was called. Bruce was transported to Queen Elizabeth Hospital. He was pronounced dead at the hospital. The official cause of death was hypersensitivity to one of the components of the Exhaustion tablet, specifically meprobamate, a tranquilizing compound that the official pathology attributed as the proximate cause of the cerebral edema. The body of a man who had already experienced one cerebral edema event in the preceding 2 months had encountered a compound to which it had a severe hypersensitive reaction, and the reaction had produced the swelling that ended his life. This is the official account. Bolo Yeung has never directly contested the official account. What he has done, in his most recent interviews, is provide a context for the official account that the official account did not contain. He has described a body that had been systematically depleted across months of filming, not acutely ill, not suddenly compromised, but gradually moved into a state of chronic physiological deficit that had reduced its margin for error to something very small. The dehydration was chronic. The thermal regulation was impaired. The metabolic stress was sustained and unrelieved. The medication was regular. The Exhaustion tablet was, in this context, not the cause of death in the way that a single event causes a single outcome. It was the final increment added to a body that had already been loaded past the point where one more increment was safe to add. He described what he saw on the set of Enter the Dragon and in the weeks that followed with the specific careful language of someone who has chosen the words that will be received and not the words that will be dismissed, who has learned across 50 years of being asked about this to deliver the truth in the form that the truth can survive in. He said, "I watched him work in a way that I had never seen anyone work before. What he could do was extraordinary. And the gap between what he was doing and what a body can sustain doing, that gap was always getting smaller. I watched it get smaller every day. I did not know how to stop it. I do not know if anyone could have stopped it. But the gap getting smaller was not invisible. I could see it. I saw it every day." The production of Enter the Dragon was completed. The film was sent to its distributors. The release was planned. Bruce Lee died on July 20, 1973. The film premiered on July 26, 1973. 6 days. The decision to proceed with the release on the original schedule was made by Golden Harvest and Warner Brothers within the first days of Bruce's death. The decision has been described variously as a business necessity, as a tribute to Bruce's wish for the film to reach its audience, and as a decision whose logic was entirely practical and entirely inseparable from the fact that the film represented a significant financial investment whose return was contingent on the release proceeding. Enter the Dragon made $52 million in its initial release. It had cost $850,000 to produce. This ratio, 61:1, represents one of the most significant returns on investment in the history of American cinema and one of the most specific demonstrations of what Bruce Lee had been trying to prove about Asian leading men and global audiences. He was not alive to see it. Raymond Chow's role in the events of July 20th has been one of the specific subjects that Bolo Yeung has addressed in recent accounts with a care that suggests he has thought about it for 50 years. He has not accused Chow of wrongdoing. He has not suggested that the meeting between Chow and Bruce at the house that afternoon was anything other than what it was reported to be, a script discussion, an ordinary professional encounter between partners in a production. What he has said is that the people closest to Bruce in the final weeks of his life had reached a point where the concern for Bruce's physical condition had become something they carried but did not know how to act on. Because Bruce was not a man who accepted concern that translated into restriction. Because the people around him had each, at some point, attempted to express the concern and had received the response that communicated that it had been heard and had not changed anything. The phone call. The account of a phone call received by Bruce shortly before his collapse at Betty Ting Pei's apartment, a call whose origin and content have not been officially confirmed or documented, appears in multiple witness accounts from people who were present in or near the apartment that afternoon. The accounts describe Bruce receiving a call, speaking animatedly, and then the call ending and Bruce becoming quiet in a way that his normal speech rhythms did not produce. No record of this call appears in the official police investigation documentation. The documentation is, by all accounts, incomplete. Whether the call was significant, whether its content was relevant to Bruce's state in the hours before his collapse, is something that 50 years of investigation has not resolved. The specific theories that circulate around the call include the professional, business tension around his planned production independence, the personal, relationship complications that would have been managed privately, and the conspiratorial, threats, warnings, the foul play hypothesis that has never been definitively addressed or definitively dismissed. Bolo Yeung's position on the foul play hypothesis is one that he has communicated obliquely rather than directly. He has said, "I do not know what killed him. I know what I saw. What I saw was a body that was being asked to do things that bodies are not designed to do indefinitely. Whether what happened at the end was connected to that or whether it was something different, I cannot say that with certainty. What I can say is that by July 1973, Bruce Lee's body had very little remaining margin. Any additional stress would have found that. This is not a statement that closes a door. It is a statement that describes the dimensions of the room behind it." Brandon Lee died on March 31, 1993, on the set of The Crow in Wilmington, North Carolina. He was 28 years old. He was shot by a prop gun that contained a real bullet, a live round that had been lodged in the barrel from a previous scene and that was discharged when blank powder was fired behind it. The circumstances were the result of a production accident, a failure of the specific safety protocols that governed the use of firearms on film sets, a failure that in any single part would not have been sufficient to cause the outcome and that in combination produced it. He died in the same way his father died, suddenly, on the edge of something, at the moment when everything he had built was about to reach its audience. The Crow was released on May 11, 1994. Brandon Lee was on screen for nearly the entire film. The production used a combination of footage shot before his death and computer-generated completion of the scenes that remained unfilmed. The film was finished. The film was released. The man who made it was gone. The parallels are not subtle and they are not coincidental in the sense of being meaningless. They are the specific parallels of two lives that followed similar trajectories toward similar outcomes, separated by 20 years, connected by genetics and by the specific cultural inheritance that being Bruce Lee's son carried. Bolo Yeung knew Brandon. He watched him grow up. He watched him become his own practitioner, his own artist, his own person who was also always in some fundamental sense his father's son, carrying the name and the expectation and the legacy in the same body that was trying to be something of its own. He does not speak about Brandon at length. When he does, the care in his language increases to the maximum level he applies to any subject. He describes Brandon as someone who understood what the inheritance meant and who was trying to honor it without being diminished by it, and who was very nearly succeeding. Very nearly. The insurance policy. In the months before his death, Bruce Lee signed a life insurance contract. The specific terms of the policy, its value, its beneficiaries, the specific conditions it covered, have been the subject of incomplete and sometimes contradictory reporting for 50 years, because the full documentation has never been publicly released and the partial documentation that has surfaced is insufficient to establish the complete picture. What can be established from available sources is that the policy existed, that its purchase was made in a period of several months before Bruce's death, and that the timing of the purchase coincided with a period in which Bruce was actively pursuing the production independence that would have required significant legal and financial infrastructure, a production company, distribution arrangements, contractual relationships that were not mediated by Golden Harvest or Warner Brothers in the way that his existing work had been. The significance of the policy in the context of the questions surrounding his death has been interpreted in two fundamentally different ways. The first interpretation is that the policy was a practical decision made by a man who was taking his career seriously, who had a family with 2 young children, who was entering into significant financial arrangements that involved personal exposure, and who was being responsible in the way that responsible people are responsible, by protecting the people and the interests that depended on him. The second interpretation is that the policy was evidence of something more specifically motivated. That Bruce Lee, who had spoken to Linda multiple times about not expecting to live past 33, who had been aware since the May collapse that his body was sending signals he had chosen to override, had made the specific calculation of a man who was not entirely certain he was going to be around for what came next. Bolo Yeung's most recent accounts have not addressed the insurance policy directly. What they have addressed is the sense that he describes as having been present on the set with a consistency that made it impossible to dismiss, that Bruce Lee was operating in the final months of his life with the specific quality of urgency that people operate with when they believe, at some level, that the time available is not as long as the plans require. He was not suicidal. He was not deliberately damaging himself. He was the opposite of deliberately damaging himself. He was working harder than he had ever worked, producing more, creating more, pushing himself and everyone around him toward an output level that the urgency demanded. But the urgency was there. And the body, pushed by urgency, had very little remaining margin for the unexpected. What Bolo Yeung has finally said, across a series of interviews conducted in the years following his 80th birthday, is not a revelation in the sense of new information that changes the known facts. The known facts have been available, in their various incomplete and contradictory forms, for 50 years. What Bolo has provided is witness testimony. Not the testimony of someone at a remove from events, the testimony of someone who was physically present, who watched the man work every day, who had the specific combination of physical knowledge and martial arts understanding to read what the performance did not show, who knew what a body under maximum sustained stress looked like from the inside, and who watched the distance between maximum sustained stress and failure get smaller across the months of Enter the Dragon's production. He said, "What Bruce did was not sustainable. I knew it when I watched it. I knew it in a way that did not require medical training to know. It was the knowledge of someone who has spent his entire life in his body and who can look at another person's body and read the signals that the performance does not communicate. The signals were clear. They were clear for months. And the performance was so extraordinary that the signals were invisible to anyone who did not know where to look." He said, "I looked where others did not look. I saw what I saw. I have carried what I saw for 50 years. I am not carrying it because I wanted to keep something from the world. I am carrying it because some truths are heavy and they do not become lighter by being spoken quickly." He paused. He said, "What killed Bruce Lee was Bruce Lee. Not the tablet. Not a phone call. Not a conspiracy. Bruce Lee. What he was willing to do to become what he needed to be. What he would not allow his body to require that he give up. What he decided the limits were. He was right about almost everything. About this one thing, about what the body would and would not sustain, he was wrong." He said, he was 32 years old. He was in the process of changing the world. He could not stop. He looked away from the camera. He said, "That is what I saw. That is what nobody wanted to say for 50 years. That is what I have finally said." Bruce Lee died on July 20, 1973. He was 32 years old. He weighed 130 pounds. He had been training for 6 hours a day for 15 years. He had made 4 films and changed the way the world understood what a film could be and who could be at its center. The film that proved everything he had been trying to prove opened 6 days after his death. He never saw the audience receive it. Bolo Yeung attended the premiere. He sat in the dark and watched the screen and watched Bruce Lee on it, the specific presence that the camera had required special adjustment to capture, the movement that the film had been shot at 32 frames per second to make visible, the speed and the power and the precision that Bolo had watched being produced every day for months on a set in Hong Kong. He watched the audience receive it. He knew, watching them, that what they were receiving was not what he had watched being made. Not because it was fiction, the capability on screen was real, the technique was genuine, the physical achievement was everything it appeared to be and more. But the thing he had watched being made had cost something that the screen did not show. The thing on the screen was the output. The cost was not on the screen. He has been carrying the cost for 50 years. He set some of it down recently. Not all of it. Some things are carried because the people who witness them have decided, for their own reasons, that witnessing requires a duration that outlasts the audience's desire for resolution. Some things are carried because putting them down completely would mean releasing a weight that is also a connection, and the connection is the last remaining form of a presence that no other form of carrying can preserve. Enter the Dragon is still being watched. 50 years later, it is still being watched by new audiences who did not exist in 1973 and who will not exist in another 50 years, by people who are finding in the specific quality of what is on screen the thing that Bolo Yeung watched being produced and that ended the life of the person who produced it. The distance between making it and being gone was 6 days. The distance between 6 days and 50 years is the distance that Bolo Yeung has been crossing in his own way, one interview at a time, moving toward the truth at the pace that he has determined is the right pace, which is his pace, which has always been his. He arrived. What he found when he got there was not a mystery solved. It was a life lived completely, at a cost that the life insisted on, by a man who understood the cost and chose to pay it. Everything Bruce Lee was, he made. Everything it cost him, he paid. And the world that received what he made, which was the world, received it without ever fully accounting for the price on the receipt. Bolo Yeung is accounting for it now. In the way that witnesses do.